Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, the Answer Company. The division championship Minnesota Twins are looking to go all the way to the World Series in 2024. Bolstered by inspirational shortstop Carlos Correa, a healthy Brian Buxton, and rookie phenom Royce Lewis, plus a pitching staff led by Pablo Lopez and an outstanding bullpen featuring Johan Duran, the Twins are the best bargain in the major leagues, and Target Field is the best venue in baseball. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. Thank you for joining us on this winter day. It's a pleasure to welcome back to our show today an old friend of ours and an occasional guest host, Dane Smith, who is a renowned, distinguished journalist and author of many years. Dane, welcome back. Happy New Year. Welcome back to Access to Democracy.
Thanks, Steve.
So we are having you back to really continue a discussion that we had on your last interview in this past year when we were talking about your series of articles that you're writing for the online newspaper MinnPost.
Right.
And the title of the article was Reappraising Minnesota, or the series, Reappraising Minnesota, a State That Works. Tell me what prompted this series.
Okay, well, this is the cover of Time magazine in early August of 1973. It is perhaps one of the most important things ever written in the national media about Minnesota. And it was called, the headline was The Good Life in Minnesota. The article inside was, the subhead was The State That Works. And
tell them who's pictured on there for folks who may not be able to see who that is.
This is Governor Wendell Anderson. He was a highly successful governor, the architect of major changes in Minnesota's political culture and things like the Minnesota Miracle he was famous for, which equalized education, greatly increased investment in economic security, and really put Minnesota on the map. Not just him, but other people in both parties were praised in this piece for being open-minded, progressive, practical, concerned about community and social welfare. And especially it praised business leaders who were philanthropists and who cared for more than profits and invested in their communities, sustained the arts and so forth.
Is it fair to say, Dane, that the politics of today is very, very different from what it was 50 years ago when this magazine came out? That our politics today seems to be much more polarized than it was then. People worked across the aisle to get things done. And isn't that what kind of prompted you to embark upon this series in MinnPost?
Yes. Well, part of the reason I wanted to do it is it's been exactly 50 years, and I thought it'd be a good time to reassess and reevaluate then and now. I don't much care for the word polarization, actually, because it suggests that both sides are responsible for the difference. What has really changed is the Republican Party's attitudes and acceptance of the idea of a social contract. When Governor Anderson was leading this state, Republican leadership and business leadership, most of whom were Republicans, actually cooperated with the idea of investing in education, investing in infrastructure. They supported things like economic security programs, healthcare programs, expanding access to healthcare. And what's changed is Republicans are opposed to that.
Right. And can we go back just real quickly? You mentioned the Minnesota Miracle, which for those of us who study politics, that's sort of shorthand. I want to say real quickly, that was about a fundamental change in how Minnesota financed public education.
Yes.
That before the Minnesota Miracle, it pretty much depended on local property taxes, how much went to schools. But Governor Anderson and both conservative and liberal, as they were known then, Democrat, Republican today, legislators worked to change that to try to equalize school funding so the kids in Minneapolis had a fair shot at getting education the same as kids in Edina or in northern Minnesota or elsewhere. Yeah.
Yes, it did that, but also it was more than that. It was actually a huge tax increase, amounting to about 16%. Wow. Which is still historically the highest increase of any
and it came out
product.
Of the longest special session of the legislature in the history of the state, right?
It increased income taxes and sales taxes, but reduced property taxes, but there was a net increase in the size of the public sector. And Republicans supported this because it made sense. And now the Republican Party and the conservative movement, instead of becoming a good government party, has primarily become an anti-government party. That is a crucial difference.
Why has this happened, do you think?
Well, it's part and parcel of a national trend, starting with Reagan in the early 80s, and the idea that government is the enemy or is the problem, and that efforts to equalize opportunity and equalize economic security were somehow un-American. That's absolutely not true. The first principle in the Declaration of Independence is that all people are equal. But I think what also drove it was the beginnings of a racial resentment to the civil rights movement, and it spread north. It started in the South. And the opposition to full and equal status and equal outcomes for all people, regardless of their race, and it was also a reaction. We saw conservatism begin to react to women's rights, to environmentalism, and to GLBTQ rights. All of that was a reaction. And it was really, the racial part of it was really, I think, still underappreciated, and it was absolutely a crucial factor.
I want to ask you about something that you wrote in the MinnPost series. Time magazine's love poem to our, quote, good life probably rang true or held promise for most white Minnesotans 50 years ago when the Time magazine issue came out. It surely sounded hollow to many of about 80,000 blacks and other folks of color in 1973, and who now number about 1.4 million today.
Right.
Isn't this, in fact, one of the most important demographic changes in Minnesota's history? And what are some of the implications of that for the future?
Yes, it absolutely is probably the most important way in which Minnesota has changed. We went from 2% people of color to 24% of people of color over those 50 years. Now, we're still considerably whiter than the rest of the country. The total average people of color in the United States is about 40%, and we are at 24%. So we're approaching the equilibrium there. But the rate of change was one of the steepest in the country. And I think the discomfort by many white people in this state with that rate of change has changed our politics too. I think
so. Today, just on the demographics, I understand we have one of the largest East African populations of any state in the country. We have the largest Somali population in the U.S., I believe.
Yes.
And a large number of people from Ethiopia and Eritrea.
And Hmong, right.
And also one of the largest Hmong populations, and a growing Latino population of people from Mexico and Central and South America.
One of the most interesting things about Minnesota's diversity, I think, is the diversity of our diversity. In the southern states, the diversity is represented mostly by blacks, descendants of the slavocracy. In the southwestern states, it's almost entirely Latino. California on the coast, it's largely Asian. Minnesota is between those major subgroups, almost equally divided between blacks at about 7%, Latinos at 6%, Asians at 6 or so, and then multiracial 4%. So that's just by itself an interesting fact that our diversity is so diverse, but it also makes addressing the inequalities around diversity a little more complicated too. It's not just one set of people or one culture that we need to do equity work on.
What are some, I think one of the most important parts of your series that you wrote was part 2, dealing with racial issues that are occurring in Minnesota. Right. What are some of the disparities that you uncovered relating to race?
Well, you know, I actually have behind each of these parts in the series, I have a listing of rankings that are significant for Minnesota. And let me just quickly take a look at here at the chapter I wrote. Okay, so there's been a lot of headlines and discussion over the last 10 to 15 years about Minnesota actually having worse racial disparities than other countries, despite our history of support for civil rights. Hubert Humphrey, we were going back to 1858 in our founding. We were a fiercely abolitionist, anti-slavery state, and we were among the first to pass the laws all through our history. Minnesota was out front in passing laws and regulations that made sure that people of color weren't discriminated against, but in fact they were. There's something called de jure slavery, which is set into law, or de jure racism, or discrimination, and then there's de facto, what happens underneath in the real world. And what happened in Minnesota with this is that as we accepted hundreds of thousands of people coming here for this good life, for this equality that we're all about from the beginning, many of these folks are poor. They're from some of the poorest regions of Africa. The Hmong were among some of the poorest people in Asia. Latinos had little money or property as they arrived here to work our land. And because Minnesota's white people were better off than white people in other states, all of a sudden you have disparities.
But originally, the original white European settlers who came here, now some of them came from well-to-do families in New England. They were so-called Yankee stock. We're talking the Pillsburys, the Daytons, some of the founding families of Minnesota. But many others later from Scandinavia and Germany and other parts, they may have been from different backgrounds or maybe have been poor. But what's changed is this racial component that we don't see so much European immigration anymore. It's from Africa and from Asia and Latin America.
Interesting little side note there. You know, we often hear, well, my Swedish ancestors came here and the government didn't give them anything, and they worked hard and they rose and they became part of the prosperity narrative. In fact, many of those early immigrants were given large amounts of land.
The Homestead
The
Act
Homestead
after
Act.
the Civil War.
Right. And that land was a basis of wealth.
Which, by the way, that land was taken from the indigenous people of Minnesota, the Lakota and Chippewa people who had lived here for centuries.
They benefited from one of the biggest giveaways in American history.
I want to ask you about this term that we seem to hear so much in the news, and particularly among conservatives warning us about so-called wokeism and woke Americans. And tell us, what is your understanding of what woke means, and what are we talking about when people say we have to stop wokeism?
I'm glad you asked that question. I actually brought, I have on my screen, on my phone here, a definition of woke. This is the accepted definition from Wikipedia, but you can see it in dictionaries, and this is what it is. It's an adjective derived from African American Vernacular English, acronym is AAVE, meaning, quote, alert to racial prejudice and discrimination, unquote. Beginning in the 2010s, it came to encompass a broader awareness of social inequalities such as racial injustice, sexism, and denial of LGBT rights. Who is against that awareness?
Apparently a lot of people.
Right.
We have Governor DeSantis in Florida trying to limit school curriculum about how we teach about America's past, about slavery, about race relations, about LGBTQ people.
Right, it's been demonized.
So apparently a lot of people are not in favor of that.
But we've seen this throughout American history. Whenever some big advance occurs, abolition of slavery, desegregation and civil rights in the 1960s, and now post-George Floyd, more of this understanding and emphasis of white privilege and the idea that very debilitating and serious discrimination and resentment are affecting our society. Every time this happens, we have white backlash, and the anti-woke thing is just yet another sad chapter in backlash history.
You mentioned the George Floyd murder 2020, one of the most traumatic events in Minnesota's history, and you point to it as an example of something that dramatically changed the nation's and the world's impression of what Minnesota was about, or what Minnesota is. Isn't it true, though, that for many years there have been local activists, people of color in the minority community, who had been warning for years about excesses that were being committed by police against people in minority communities, and that these warnings were being largely ignored until the murder of George Floyd and the chaos that followed that?
Right. The complaints about discrimination and brutality in the police department, specifically the Minneapolis Police Department, go back at least 50 years, at least, probably farther. And then before that, there were complaints of corruption. So that has been a sore point for a long, long time. And it finally broke into the open.
May of 2020.
May of 2020. And, even as when this article ran in 1973, Minneapolis was governed by the mayor was Charlie Stenvig, who ran on white backlash against all the civil rights stuff. He was a police officer,
MPD,
a Minneapolis police officer, and he was arguing that we got to get tough on these black kids and these college students, and he was just a classic example of sort of people who denied that racism was a problem and actually advocated for rather brutal suppression.
Isn't it interesting, Dane, that one of the reactions to the events of George Floyd, you saw a reaction of some people on the city council and many white so-called progressives who immediately said, well, we need to defund or abolish the police. But one problem, they didn't talk to people of color who lived in those communities who were victims of crime, and in fact, there wasn't a backlash that supported getting rid of the police. The Minneapolis voters voted decidedly against that,
Right.
including people of color in both the north and south side and throughout the city.
Right.
So getting rid of the police wasn't really the answer they wanted. They wanted better policing. They wanted honest policing from police who cared
Right.
about their communities and treated people fairly, right?
Yes. The proposal itself that was defeated was not exactly about abolishing.
No, it was
or-
creating
or-
a commission where they would have the
Right,
option.
Right. It was actually about police reform.
Right.
The labeling of it was unfortunate. Defunding sounds like no funding, and in fact, they were talking about better policing. But yeah, we needed even then to listen to black people like Nakima Levy-Pounds, a great leader for civil rights in this state, who I think properly criticized white progressives for not actually listening to what black people were saying. And this is a recurring problem in Minnesota's sort of well-meaning history, or well-meaning attitudes.
White progressives think they know the solution to the
Right.
problems in communities of color
Exactly.
better than the people who live there, which doesn't really make much sense, does
There's a
it?
great saying that captures this, and that is that it goes like this: nothing about us without us. In other words, we need to move forward in partnership with people of color,
Right.
not as
We know better.
white paternalistic saviors. That's not the model that works.
I want to ask you about this. In one of your articles, I think it was in part 2, you stated, quote, racial disparities have become our most egregious flaw, and that, quote, effective reparation and reconciliation should rank as a top priority. I want to ask you, Dane, what does that look like to you? Are reparations only about monetary payments, or do we need to rethink what reparations could look like? And is any of this even possible in our current political environment?
Well, I think it is possible, and it's moving forward, interestingly, not through some big federal program or even state programs, but at the grassroots. There's foundation support for small amounts of reparation for very specific forms of discrimination, such as racial covenants in housing, which really affected Minnesota.
Say real quickly what those were for people who may not know.
There were racial covenants in houses that were built, especially in the big housing boom of the teens, 20s, and 30s here in Minnesota. The language in the deed, when you got it, actually said things like, premises shall not be sold, mortgaged, or leased to or occupied by any person or persons other than members of the Caucasian race.
Right, which that's pretty blunt.
Right.
But of course now those are illegal. There have been
Right.
laws that have changed that.
They were set aside actually as early as 1960, and Minnesota was
Right.
one of the first states to say these no longer apply.
But we used
the
to
damage
have
had been
those.
done.
Right.
Right.
And in fact, when you think about it, that issue of home ownership is so central to the
Yes.
accumulation of wealth. Most people in Minnesota and around the country, they're not accumulating wealth by playing the stock market.
Right.
They accumulate wealth by owning a home and seeing the value of that home appreciate over time.
passing it on to their
so
children.
when we had these
Right.
laws that said you couldn't buy in certain neighborhoods simply because of your race,
Right.
that tied people's hands behind their back before they could even begin to accumulate wealth. Yeah.
Right. Well, backtracking a little bit to your question about what reparations and reconciliation means, it can take many, many forms. One of the more obvious is big, broad public policy that provides more educational opportunity, and this requires public investment and taxes. Healthcare for everyone is a huge leveler. But in many cases, St. Paul, I think, is an example of a city that is actually paying some reparations to families directly impacted by building the I-94
Through the Rondo.
interstate through the Rondo neighborhood, which is one of the more successful, prosperous black neighborhoods in the state. There's a lot of imagination and creativity is being brought to the idea of reparations, but it's an old idea, as old as General Sherman's idea after the Civil War, to give every black person who had been enslaved 40 acres and a mule, and to give them that property from the estates of places of their slaveholders. That was an obvious reparation that made sense. We didn't do it. There have been studies showing that the net value of segregation, discrimination in this country is something like $6 trillion, just to black Americans. And there's precedent for reparations for what we did to the Japanese in World War II.
You've mentioned the 2023 session of the Minnesota legislature produced a number of laws and public investments of historic proportions dealing with racial equity. Minnesota, we have our first indigenous lieutenant governor in the state's history, Peggy Flanagan. And in fact, there's a new People of Color and Indigenous caucus in the Minnesota legislature that now makes up 15% of the legislature.
Yes.
That's really a remarkable development, isn't it?
It is. It is. The representation by people of color in our legislature now is almost equal to the population, which is astounding. It lagged way behind for many, many years, many decades. As a percentage of people of color increased, it's still an all-white legislature, a real breakthrough in 2023. But then in policy, everything to do with voting rights, expanding access to people who have been previously incarcerated, which has a tremendous racial disparity to it. All these things make kind of a turning point on this whole issue of whether we're doing right by people. I think it's really important to emphasize how much people of color have contributed to this state. Many of them are lowest paid workers. They have built this economy on many rankings. We're better than we were in 1973, richer, stronger, more just a better quality of life in many ways, and people of color have contributed to this.
Important point. Dane, before we go, we're down to 30 seconds. Where can our viewers go if they want to read your series in MinnPost?
Just Google for Reappraising Minnesota MinnPost, and it'll show up. All the articles are there. And there's been 8 of them so far. There'll be a couple more to go.
Very good.
And I think folks will enjoy it and find it provocative at least.
Journalist, author, thank you for your articles, and thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy.
Thanks, Steve.